Turning to the written papers on what Sam and Amy call the farming inequality nexus, I find a project that is actually much more cautious and much more modest, actually, in scope. It deals with wealth inequality in a highly abstract sense, rather than the lived experience of social inequality. The question of how wealth in material goods is translated into power over other people is not broached except in relation to arable land. Questions of class, race, gender, age, caste, or patron-client relations are largely left aside, nor are questions of value addressed or the social forms taken by labor, except in relation to this very generalized notion of slavery. In other words, although it's certainly concerned with material things, this is not a historical materialist approach, at least not in any sense that I'm familiar with that concept. Instead, a new method is proposed. And I hope Sam doesn't mind me borrowing a couple of images from his pre-circulated paper, which is very helpful. The method is based on the application of econometric tools to archaeological evidence, and these provide measurements of a strictly limited kind. Sam talked a lot about cows, but actually there are no cows in these measurements. They relate strictly to the size of house foundations in ancient settlements, and also to grave goods, in other words, the number of items placed with the dead in a burial. Or more accurately, I should say, those which have survived for archaeologists to inspect because they were produced in durable materials. And based on this evidence, we're presented with a broad account of the transition from unstable to enduring systems of wealth inequality, which I would just briefly paraphrase because I know some people got stuck on the train and they missed the first talk. So it goes like this, so far as I understand it. It's an in the beginning story, so in the beginning, economic inequality was based on labor. In labor-limited economies, growth was limited. So life was relatively egalitarian. Such inequalities as did exist were also limited and unstable. Then, in several specific locations around the world, durable wealth inequalities came into being, and what triggered this was a shift from labor-limited to land-limited economies. As we've heard, this happened in three ways. Firstly, the introduction of the plow increased productivity of arable land and the scale of farming. Second, this created competition for land and increased its value. Third, a permanent gap emerged between hereditary landowners and an underclass, and I quote here from one of the papers, an underclass of renters, sharecroppers, clients, employees, or unfree labor, now alienated from the primary means of food production. Now, in outline, I think this story will be very familiar to economists, right? Actually, it looks back to the foundational theories of political economy in the 17th and 18th centuries as formulated by men like John Locke, Anne-Robert Turgot, Adam Smith, at a time when archaeology didn't really exist. It's a story which is deeply embedded in European philosophy and the social sciences and in the historical experience of land enclosure and privatization, industrialization, and empire. For all these reasons, I think we have to pay very close attention to the methods that are employed in making such arguments today, bearing in mind that Sam and Amy themselves characterize this work, and I quote, as one of plausible conjecture rather than tested hypothesis. In another paper co-authored with Michael Focisato, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the authors have really done their best to control for problems with archaeological sample size and also the relative invisibility of those without wealth in the archaeological record. However, I think some fundamental questions of method have yet to be addressed before we can move with confidence from measurements to models. And with that in mind, I want to raise several questions around issues of plausibility and then come back to some broader observations on the proposed reconstruction. I ended up with 13 points, which I'll try to keep brief because I know that everybody wants to go to lunch. First of all, grave goods. Can the measurement of grave goods placed with the dead serve as a reliable proxy for hereditary wealth inequality in ancient societies without attention to contextual factors? Just to offer one counterexample, in relatively recent times, indigenous populations in northwestern California buried a chief's most treasured possessions alongside him. But they did this as a strategy of social leveling. The point was to prevent his descendants from inheriting them, ensuring they would have to make their own fortunes on a level playing field. If a similar society, hypothetically, say 5,000 years ago, buried its dead that way for generations, we might be tempted to place it near the top of our inequality index based on its rich burials. But we'd be mistaken to do so, because the burials are in fact a social mechanism for suppressing hereditary wealth inequality among the living, rather like the Tandre example from Madagascar. Architecture, and this really relates to what Amy called governance. Can house size really serve as a proxy for wealth inequality without attention to contextual factors? Another counterexample. Historically, Iroquoian and Algonquian societies had impressive longhouses with copious storage space. So did societies on the Pacific Northwest coast. If we rely on disparities of house size, we might rank these societies in similar positions on an inequality index. But what would we actually learn by doing this about the evolution of inequality, given that household wealth in Iroquoian societies, including agricultural surplus, was managed by women's collectives, while on the Northwest Coast, households were internally divided into ranks of male nobles, commoners, and slaves. Which brings me on to point 3, slavery. There is no more enduring form of inequality among human beings than hereditary slavery. In the history of the Pacific Northwest Coast, we find such institutions highly developed across non-agricultural societies, hunters, fishers, and gatherers, covering the entire region from Alaska down to Washington state. A detailed statistical analysis was provided by the historian Leland Donald in his 1997 book, Aboriginal Slavery on the Northwest Coast. He concluded that in economic terms, these truly were slave-based economies, in which perhaps a quarter of the indigenous population lived in bondage, which is roughly the equivalent, I think, to proportions in the Roman Empire or classical Athens, or indeed the cotton plantations of the American South. Which brings me on to point 4, labor-limited versus land-limited economies. In their wider reconstruction, Sam and Amy and colleagues acknowledge the presence of slavery in some hunter-gatherer populations, but they characterize it as rare and episodic. Elsewhere, they appear to suggest that slavery intensifies as part of the transition from labor-limited to land-limited forms of economy associated with the shift to mechanized farming. But on the Pacific Northwest Coast, archaeologists like the late Ken Amers have plausibly traced a long and stable history for institutions of warfare and slavery extending back almost 4,000 years in the absence of agriculture. Growth in these societies often took the form of raiding one's neighbors for people, and especially for women. Anthropologists have generally agreed that this was not because of any overall shortage of people. It was because the nobles and the commoners basically refused to perform manual labor, including the seasonal processing of fish harvests on which the whole economy depended. Uneven access to prime fishing sites no doubt did create conditions comparable to a land-limited economy, but the ultimate cause of slavery, according to Donald and other experts, was a socially induced shortage of labor. Fernando Santos Granero has devoted an entire book to economies of this kind, which also existed in other parts of the Americas, including among non-agricultural populations, like the Calusa of Florida Keys and the Guaycuru of the Paraguay Palm Savanna. His book is called Vital Enemies: Slavery, Predation, and the Amerindian Political Economy of Life. He calls these capturing societies, and he shows how in some cases these kinds of arrangements led to stable, full-blown kingdoms with enduring distinctions of class and caste. In any general account of the evolution of inequality, clearly these societies ought to feature, but it's difficult for me to see how they could ever be accommodated to the farming inequality nexus, coming to Sam's question about the general applicability or not of the model. On to point 5. The assumption, even in a Eurasian context, that before the inception of land-limited economies, economic differences were based solely on human labor seems problematic to me for large parts, for the history of large parts of the world, including most of Africa. In Nilotic and Bantu populations, cattle provided a form of stable intergenerational wealth inequality, which supported the formation of large kingdoms, even empires, long before land became scarce or intrinsically valuable, and long before cattle were ever used for traction. This is also true for some parts of Eurasia, and actually there's an echo of it in the Latin root of the word capital. Capital coming from caput, which refers both to chattels and to a head of cattle. In such societies, wealth was traditionally counted not by the size of one's house, but by the size of one's herd. On to number 6, archaeology and the Gini coefficient. As originally applied to modern economies, and actually Corrado Gini was Mussolini's economist. He was a fascist as well as a racist, which is why the nation state is always the superordinate unit of comparison. So it assumes, as a method, it assumes comparability between the units compared. And as I say, these are usually nation states because they're considered to be meaningful economic units. Without some such baseline of comparability across institutional forms, I think the comparative exercise quickly loses meaning. So my question really is, what is the institutional baseline that allows us to compare Gini coefficients from, say, Neolithic Turkey to the early Roman Republic to modern Britain? And this is really a question about number 7, the archaeological record. In the pre-circulated paper, we are asked to compare Gini coefficients ascribed to archaeological sites. So I'm directing you here to the image on the right, which we've seen before. Sites like Tel Brak in Syria, Tepegara in northern Iraq, and Eridu in southern Iraq. Each site, as you can see, appears as a data point on a graph or a particular stratigraphic horizon within it, and the graph is captioned Inequality in Material Wealth in Western Eurasia from the end of the Paleolithic to the Roman Empire. However, as Focesato and colleagues themselves note, archaeological sites are not equivalent to past populations or to societies, nor are the individual stratigraphic phases within them, which raises questions about point 8, scale. Tepegara is a tiny place. It covers just 2 hectares, and it contains architectural remains spanning 3,000 years or more. Tel Brak, which we heard about in Amy's presentation, covers an area of 130 hectares, completely different order of magnitude, and only a tiny, tiny fraction of that area has actually been investigated by archaeologists. But both, as you can see, appear on the graph as equally weighted data points with an assigned Gini coefficient. Sam and colleagues themselves, to their credit, note, and I'll quote now from their paper, 2 societies with equal wealth inequality by our measures may differ substantially in social complexity, political hierarchy, disparities in consumption, economic injustice, and other dimensions associated with the term wealth inequality. I agree, and I admire their candor, but again, it makes me wonder what use we can make of the findings, for example, in thinking about the roots of contemporary inequalities. brings me on to point 9, forms of property, part 1. Similar problems arise, I think, in relation to a study that's been quite widely referred to by Kohler et al., which argues that overall levels of inequality were much higher in Bronze Age Eurasia than in pre-Columbian North America and Mesoamerica. Again, on closer inspection, the findings turn out to be more modest. They are based on a single proxy measure of wealth inequality, in this case, the relative sizes of preserved house foundations in the archaeological record. The results are still interesting because of their scope, but perhaps I wonder if there may be better ways of interpreting them, which brings me on to forms of property, part 2. In many parts of pre-colonial North America, social influence was not primarily grounded in the stockpiling of wealth or the defense of landed estates. Instead, influence was vested in control over forms of intellectual property that comprised specialized knowledge and ritual prerogatives pertaining to things like the design of calendrical earthworks, or the right to perform a certain dance, or administer a particular kind of medicine, or use a particular kind of image, for example. Ownership of such goods, which we could compare to our patents and copyrights, unlocked rights of usufruct, a concept we haven't discussed, over land and resources. So land and tools could be freely shared, but the initiatory powers to grow maize or pursue game were individually held, inherited, bought, and sold. So when arguing or when making the case that overall differences of wealth are rooted in factors of agrarian production, I think it's important to recall that the dispossession of First Nations lands, not just in America, but also in Africa and Oceania, was based on a denial that such alternative forms of property counted as legal title, which European scholars and European settlers insisted must be based on territorial sovereignty and extensive farming. And of course, today such claims are being contested in courts of law by indigenous communities in America, Canada, Australia, and other places. Point 11, linear and taxonomic inequality. I'm not sure if I just invented these terms or if David did, and I can't remember. But I think the work we've been talking about here basically treats inequality along a single dimension, which is linear. It allows us to rank societies along a scale. However, inequality in human societies, as we know, always has at least two basic dimensions: the linear, or how much, dimension, and what we might call the taxonomic, or what kind, dimension. The latter is closer to the classificatory hierarchies that biologists use. Levels become taxonomically higher as they become more encompassing, extending upwards to a value which is always singular, like life in biology, or like God in those wonderful medieval great chain of being kind of things that you see there. There's an amusing example of how people play on the distinction between these two kinds of inequality, and it comes in the writings of the 14th century explorer Ibn Battuta. He has a story about a king of Sind who loved to receive gifts from his visitors and then give them back something that was worth far more than what they'd given him. And a whole business apparently developed where you'd have local bankers lending money to the visitors to finance the gifts, knowing they'd actually, get paid back with interest from the proceeds of this royal largesse. The king knew about this, but he didn't care, because the whole point was to show that his wealth exceeded all possible notions of equivalence, and if necessary, he could always expropriate the bankers. And they, of course, were aware that what really mattered here in terms of the game was not the economic one about linear inequalities, but the game of status, and the king's taxonomic status was always absolute. I think what the kind of studies we've been looking at today do is to kind of strip away the whole taxonomic dimension in the hope of deciphering some deeper pattern along the linear one. Do they succeed? Point 12, how can we tell? I think one good measure of success for me would be if the findings depart in some meaningful way from the purely speculative and ideologically very freighted notions of economic progress advanced by political economy's founding fathers. And against that criterion, I think it is surely a step forward that this new research confirms a lack of correlation between the adoption of agriculture and the rise of wealth inequality. But it does so, I fear, only then to take 2 steps back, by attributing the inception of enduring wealth inequality to the adoption of the plow or similar technologies of agricultural extensification, intensification, and so on. Bringing me to my final query, point 13, inequality and the plow. On this point, the authors evoke the work of Andrew Sherratt, who drew on Jack Goody, who drew on V. Gordon Childe. In fact, Goody argued that the histories of Europe and Asia actually had far more in common than Childe supposed, because their societies shared bilateral systems of property inheritance that allowed arable land to be kept and held within status groups, defined by elaborate codes of class or caste. He thought this made them different from African societies south of the Sahara, with the exception of Ethiopia, where the plow was used. And a key factor in creating such differences, according to Goody, was the early adoption of animals for plow-based agriculture in Eurasia. Another was the growth of literate bureaucracy. In most of Africa, by contrast, inequality was about what he called wealth in people, rather than in land. I think it's intriguing to see aspects of Goody's model being revived now by Sam, Amy, and colleagues. But I also think it's important to recall that what they're reviving is only somewhat less than half of his original model. The other major part was about African state formation, including systems of enduring wealth inequality in labor-limited economies. In Africa, Goody saw this as being based less on access to the means of agricultural production than on the capture and ownership of slaves, control over foreign trade, and a monopoly on what he called the means of destruction, particularly horses, chariots, and guns. Of course, such forms of domination were also typical of European and Eurasian states, which developed them to much greater heights, eventually turning abundance into scarcity. This afternoon, Walter Scheidel will be arguing, perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, that in the broad sweep of human history, and I quote, violence has been the most important means of leveling wealth and income inequality in human history. In debating that point, when we come to it, I think we do well to reinstate the other half of Jack Goody's model, because it reminds us that organized violence, plunder, and predation, most systematically in the form of empire, was ultimately the most universal means of creating such overarching inequalities in the first place. Thank you very much.